Now let's look at the historical background of the Constitution of India. The East India Company was a private British trading company. The EIC came to India in 1600s as traders. EIC functioned as a commercial body with the court of directors at its head. But the company had a very loose control over its employees, and issues like corruption and private trade by the company servants were rampant. The servants in the EIC made huge profits in India, much to the dislike of the British politicians. So in order to regulate the affairs of the East India Company, the British government passed the Regulating Act of 1773. But why was this act so important? It was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of East India Company. The Act recognized the political and administrative functions of the East India Company. It laid the foundations of central administration in India. Now, what were the features of the Act? The Act made the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal. Warren Hastings became the first Governor General of Bengal. Now, what did it mean? Was it just a change of name? No, it meant that the Governor of Bengal was given more powers than earlier. The governors of Bombay and Madras were now made subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. Earlier, all the three governors were equivalent and worked independently of each other. But now, Governor General of Bengal could issue directives to the governors of Bombay and Madras. Thus began a centralizing tendency in governance which continued till the Charter Act of 1833. The Act also provided for a Supreme Court at Calcutta. Accepting gifts and engaging in private trade was now prohibited for the company servants. The Court of Directors of the privately owned British East India Company now had to report to the British government on its revenue, civil and military affairs in India. Thus, British government strengthened its control over the East India Company. In 1781, the Regulating Act was amended to rectify some of its defects. This was known as the Act of Settlement. But a major change happened in 1784 when the British government passed the Pitt's India Act. Let's look at the features of the Pitt's India Act. The Act distinguished between the commercial and political functions of the company. The Court of Directors managed the commercial affairs, but a new body called the Board of Control was now made responsible to handle the company's political affairs. Political affairs simply meant the expansion of British territory in India. This separation of functions between two organs was called as the system of double government. This act was also significant for two other reasons. The company's territories in India were for the first time called as the British possessions in India. The British government was given supreme control over company's affairs and its administration in India. The centralizing tendency continued till the Charter Act of 1833. It made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India. Over the years, the East India Company had expanded its control across India. So for the first time, a Government of India was created, having authority over the entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. William Bentinck became the first Governor General of India. So what additional powers were given to the Governor General of India? He was given exclusive legislative powers for the entire British India. This exclusivity meant that the governors of Bombay and Madras were deprived of their legislative powers. Earlier, the laws were known as regulations, but now the laws made by the Governor General of India were called as acts. The nature of East India Company was also changed by this act. The East India Company was no more a commercial body. It rather became a purely administrative body whose function was to facilitate the commercial activities of the private traders. The Charter Act of 1833 also tried to introduce a system of open competition for selection of civil servants by including Indians in the service of the company. But this provision was negated after opposition by the Court of Directors. Last in the series of the Charter Acts was the Charter Act of 1853. It is considered as a significant constitutional landmark. Let's look at the features of this act. It separated for the first time the legislative and the executive functions of the Governor-General of India. The separate Legislative Council with 6 additional members came to be known as the Indian Legislative Council. The Act also allowed for local representation in the Legislative Council. The word local did not mean Indians, it meant the members appointed by the provincial governments. An open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants was introduced. Macaulay Committee of 1854 was associated with it. The covenanted civil service was thus thrown open to the Indians. The Act extended the company's rule, but it did not specify any particular period unlike the previous acts. This was an indication that the British government could terminate the company rule in India and take over the powers to itself. The British government ultimately did end the company rule, as we shall see in the next video. The East India Company faced a major jolt after the Popular Revolt of 1857, also known as the First War of Independence or the Sepoy Mutiny. So now British government got to thinking, what could be done to avoid another Sepoy Mutiny? So they decided, let's take cooperation of the Indians. Thus the British government felt the necessity of seeking cooperation of Indians in the administration of the country. First such landmark change was seen in the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Let's look at its features. The Act provided that some Indians should be nominated to the Legislative Council as non-official members. What did non-official mean? It meant a member who is not a servant of the British government. In 1862, Lord Canning, the then Viceroy, nominated 3 Indians to the Legislative Council, the Raja of Banaras, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. Process of decentralization began with restoring the legislative powers of the governors of Bombay and Madras, which meant that these governors could now make laws suitable for their respective presidencies. The Act introduced for the first time a portfolio system. Portfolios are nothing but allocation of ministries as we see in present times. Benefits of portfolio system are specialization, faster decision making, and ease of governance. Another important feature was the ordinance making power. The Act allowed the Viceroy to issue ordinances without the concurrence of the Legislative Council. Ordinance was valid for 6 months. Again, we see ordinances being passed in present times as well. An ordinance is nothing but an executive order that has the same effect as a law passed by the legislature. To briefly sum up, important points of this Act are association of Indians in legislative process, marking the beginning of the representative institutions, process of decentralization, introduction of portfolio system, and provision for ordinance making powers. Now moving on to the features of the Act of 1892. It increased the number of non-official members in both the central and provincial legislative councils. However, the official majority was still maintained, meaning that the number of non-official members would not be greater than 50% of total strength of the council. Some additional powers were given to the legislative councils. For example, the power of discussing budget and addressing questions to the executive. Now, as we have seen, the non-official members were nominated by the Viceroy. But under this Act, some of the nominations were to be made on the recommendation of certain bodies. For Central Legislative Council, some recommendations were to be made by the provincial councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. For the provincial legislative councils, nominations by the governors were to be made by the recommendations of district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars, and the chambers. Thus, the Act introduced some form of local representation based on elections. The term election was, however, not used. Now let's look at the next important act, the Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. Lord Morley was the Secretary of State for India, that is, a designated member of the British Cabinet based in Britain, and Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India, based at the capital, Calcutta. The Act increased the strength of both the central and provincial legislative councils. Official majority was maintained at the Central Legislative Council, but provincial councils were now allowed to have non-official majority. Members were now allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, and so on. To understand this part better, we need to compare it with the present budgetary process. Until now, Indians were allowed only in the legislative councils in the form of non-official members. But under this Act, Indians were allowed to be part of Viceroy's Executive Council as well. Now remember, legislative councils just make laws, but the Executive Council has the powers to implement the laws. Thus, this was an important step for Indians. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. Portfolio allocated to him was law. The most controversial feature of this Act was the provision for communal representation. The Act allowed separate electorates for Muslims, which meant that the Muslim candidates would be elected only by the Muslim voters. This provision drew a lot of criticism from the Indian National Congress. Viceroy Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. Separate representation was also provided for the presidency corporations, chambers of commerce, universities, and zamindars. In 1915, Mahatma Gandhi entered the scene, and the Britishers were forced to make a lot of changes to the laws, as we shall see in the next video. In this video, we shall look at the Acts of 1919, 1935, and 1947. Let's look at the features of the Government of India Act of 1919. This act was a step towards introducing a responsible government in India. The act is also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. The act took a further step towards decentralization by dividing the central and provincial subjects. The central and provincial legislative councils were now authorized to make laws on their respective subjects. However, the overall governance structure continued to be unitary. The provincial subjects were further divided into two parts, transferred and reserved. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor on the aid and advice of the Legislative Council, but the reserved subjects were to be administered by the governor and his Executive Council without being responsible to the Legislative Council. Thus, the Legislative Council could legislate only on the matters included in the transferred subject. It had no say on the matters included in the reserved subjects. Only the Viceroy, with the aid and advice of his Executive Council, could make regulations on these subjects. This scheme of governance was known as diarchy. For the first time, bicameralism and direct elections were introduced in India. Bicameralism means two houses of legislature, like for example, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, the two houses of parliament. The Act replaced the Indian Legislative Council by a bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house, Council of State, and a lower house, Legislative Assembly. One important fact to note here is that the majority of members of both these houses were chosen by direct election. Some changes were also made in the Viceroy's Executive Council. Now, 3 out of 6 members, other than the Commander-in-Chief, were to be Indian. The Act extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, and Europeans. Even though the majority of members were directly elected, the electoral franchise was limited to few groups of people based on property, tax, or education. A new office of High Commissioner for India was created in London. Some of the functions of the Secretary of State for India were transferred to the High Commissioner. The Act provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. A Central Public Commission was established in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. For the first time, provincial budgets were separated from the central budget. The provincial legislative councils were now authorized to enact provincial budgets. Lastly, the Act provides for the appointment of a statutory commission to report on the Act 10 years after its coming into force. According to the last provision, the statutory commission should have been appointed in 1929, but as it happened, the commission was appointed in 1927 itself. At the time, Conservative government was in power in Britain and it feared losing the next election, so they appointed the commission early. Sir John Simon was made the chairman of this commission. The task of the commission was to review the working of the 1919 Act. But all the members of the commission were British. There were no Indian representatives in the commission. Owing to this, all the Indian political parties boycotted this commission. The commission made some recommendations, and to review these recommendations, 3 roundtable conferences were summoned. Some of the recommendations of this report were incorporated in the next Government of India Act of 1935. Let's look at the features of the Government of India Act of 1935. The Act was a lengthy and detailed document with 321 sections and 10 schedules. Many of the provisions of the present Constitution of India were borrowed from this Act. The Act provided for the establishment of an All India Federation consisting of provinces and princely states as units. The power was divided between centre and the units into 3 lists: Federal List, Provincial List, and the Concurrent List. The residuary powers were given to the Viceroy. The Federation, however, never came into being as the princely states did not join it. The Act abolished diarchy in provinces and introduced provincial autonomy in its place. The provinces were allowed to act as autonomous units of administration in their defined spheres. Diarchy was abolished in provinces, but it was now introduced at the centre. The federal subjects were now divided into reserved and transferred subjects. Bicameralism was introduced in some of the provincial legislatures. The principle of communal representation was further extended by introducing separate electorates for the depressed classes, women, and workers. The voting franchise was also increased to about 10% of the total population. The Act also provided for the establishment of Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and credit of India. Provisions for a Federal Public Service Commission, Provincial Public Service Commission, and Joint Public Service Commission for 2 or more states was also introduced. Lastly, the Act provided for the establishment of a federal court, which was set up later in 1937. Last in the series is the Indian Independence Act of 1947. After the agitations by the Muslim League demanding partition, the then Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, put forth Mountbatten Plan, which effectively sought to partition the country into 2 dominions. Both Congress and the Muslim League accepted the plan and the Indian Independence Act came into effect. Let's look at the features of this Act. The Act ended the British rule in India, declaring India as an independent and sovereign state from August 15, 1947. The Act provided for the partition of India into two independent dominions of India and Pakistan. The two dominions were given the right to secede from the British Commonwealth. India exited from the Commonwealth on January 26, 1950. Pakistan did so much later in 1956. The post of Viceroy was designated as Governor-General of India, who was now reduced to be a nominal head of the Dominion of India. The Act empowered the Constituent Assembly to frame and adopt a constitution. The Act also empowered the Constituent Assembly to legislate for the entire territory of India. Thus, the Constituent Assembly played two roles, that of framing the Constitution and as interim Parliament. The British also ended their paramountcy over the princely states and tribal areas. The princely states were now free to join either of the two new dominions. Some other features included transfer of veto power over bills from the British monarch to the Governor-General, designation of Governor-General and governors of provinces as nominal heads of states, dropping of the title of Emperor of India from the royal titles of the King of England, discontinuation of the appointment to civil services. With this act coming into effect at the stroke of midnight of 15th of August 1947, the British rule in India came to an end, and India achieved its independence after a long fought struggle. Lord Mountbatten became the first Governor-General of India, and Jawaharlal Nehru became the first Prime Minister of India.